I think of midlife as a time that can be a kind of reckoning for many people. Earlier in life, there's just so much forward momentum. You're building, doing, achieving, caregiving, and sometimes in all that motion, there isn't much space to notice what's missing. Then in midlife, something begins to shift. Our roles change, children grow, relationships evolve, the body may start speaking more loudly, and people begin to ask deeper questions. Not just, how do I keep up, but where do I feel nourished? Where do I feel alone? Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Medicine with Meaning. I'm Dr. Julie Taw, and I'm so glad you're here. In recent episodes, we've been exploring midlife transitions, noticing energy drains, recalibrating our health ecosystem, and beginning to live in a way that feels more supportive and aligned. Today, I want to talk about something that many people experience, but don't always name openly. That is loneliness and connection. You can be surrounded by responsibilities, colleagues, family, or even social media and still feel alone. What we now understand, both from research and from clinical experience, is that connection is not just emotional, it's biological. Our nervous systems regulate in relationships. We feel safer, more resilient, and more steady when we experience meaningful connection. So today we're going to explore how loneliness affects the body, why it can become more noticeable during midlife, and how small shifts can begin to restore a sense of well-being and support. Let's dive in.
Dr. Julie, we often think of loneliness as a social or emotional issue. From a physiological perspective, how does loneliness affect the nervous system and overall health?
I think one of the most important things to understand is that loneliness is not just a feeling that lives in the mind. The body experiences loneliness too. When someone feels chronically alone, unsupported, or emotionally disconnected, the nervous system can begin to interpret that as a kind of lack of safety. And when the body doesn't feel supported, it often becomes more vigilant. So people may notice they feel more on edge, or they feel more tired, but also wired. People are less able to recover fully from stress, less able to relax. And over time, that can influence sleep, digestion, inflammation, immune function, energy, and mood. I think, this is a very common theme we talk about in each episode. All of these things are deeply connected with our nervous system. And if someone is doing, what feels like all the right things for their health, a persistent sense of disconnection can still act like a stressor. So loneliness is not just an emotional experience. It can become a biological strain on the system. And that's part of why connection can be so healing. It helps the body feel less alone in the work of holding life together. And it's helpful for the nervous system to feel safer. And that is so key to healing.
And why can feelings of disconnection become more noticeable during midlife or life transitions?
I think of midlife as a time that can be a kind of reckoning for many people. earlier in life, there's just so much forward momentum. You're building, doing, achieving, caregiving, solving problems, moving quickly. And sometimes in all that motion, there isn't much space to notice what's missing. Then in midlife, something begins to shift. Our roles change, children grow, relationships evolve, the body may start speaking more loudly, and people begin to ask deeper questions. Not just, how do I keep up? But questions like, where do I feel nourished? Where do I feel alone? I think that's why disconnection can become more visible during midlife, not because it suddenly appears out of nowhere, but because we can no longer bypass it as easily. There's this, there's less willingness to live on autopilot. Perhaps there's more truth available. And with that truth may come the recognition that a life can look very full on the outside while still feeling emotionally thin on the inside.
And how does chronic stress or long periods of overextension make it harder for people to maintain meaningful relationships?
Well, when someone has been in a long season of overextension, their inner world tends to get very narrowed. The focus becomes getting through the day, meeting obligations, managing the next thing. And when that happens, relationships can start to feel like one more demand rather than a source of nourishment. And it's not because the person doesn't care. Usually they care deeply, but they may not have the bandwidth for presence. They may not have the emotional spaciousness to reach out, to listen well, to be vulnerable, or even to receive support. And often when people are chronically stressed, they just stop initiating connection. They cancel plans, they isolate, or sometimes they are physically with others, but they're not fully present. And that's because their system is still in a kind of internal survival mode. So one of the losses of chronic stress is that it doesn't just drain our energy. It can quietly erode the relational parts of life that would actually help restore us.
Yeah, I think I've seen it's kind of counterintuitive, right? Where you need connection, but you don't have the energy to connect. And I think I've experienced it to a certain extent with myself, but with other people who have been going through a hard time and they isolate. So it's interesting that what will bring you healing is something you don't have energy for.
Yeah, it is a vicious cycle and an understandable cycle, right? And I think, when you're stuck in that rut, people, don't even realize it. And when you're feeling depleted, pulling back can feel protective. And sometimes it is. But sometimes when that withdrawal becomes prolonged, it can start to deepen the very state that the person is trying to recover from, sort of like you said. And it's important to discern whether, your body really does need less rest and less stimulation because that's what your nervous system needs. But it's really important to, be aware of when you're withdrawing because, you're feeling overwhelmed and you stop letting people in when that can be the very thing that is most healing and most nourishing.
Yes, and allowing you to be supported by community. Sometimes we don't want to burden others, and support doesn't necessarily mean people helping you with specific problem, but just people being there around you is healing. And I find that sometimes when you're going through a hard time, you might feel like your presence is a little bit of a, I don't know if burden is a word, but you don't want to bother others with your presence.
Or, this just like very, need to be strong and independent, can sometimes, um, inhibit us from reaching out and letting people know that we're in need and that we're feeling a moment of vulnerability. And that is hard when you're in a place of not feeling your best. But the thing about being around other people is that, you can feel of course, this is someone you trust, right? That you can feel their support, their warmth, and we're even able to co-regulate, with somebody that's loving, and that can be very supportive. So, what feels like, extra work to connect with people when you're actually in their presence, it can feel really good, especially to our nervous system. And certainly feeling less alone is very nourishing for our nervous system. It gets us out of that chronic stress, fight or flight mode. So yes, it is kind of counterintuitive, as you said earlier. And it definitely can be daunting to take that first step, but that's, sometimes what's needed.
And I guess like sometimes when you feel vulnerable, you feel exposed. Like people might notice where you are at. And like you said, we are so accustomed to being independent and being strong that that might be hard to show to others. And at the same time, I'm thinking back to our last episode, I think it was when we spoke about energy chargers and energy drains, and having people connection could be an energy charger, and perhaps isolating too much could be that which is making us tired as well.
Well, you certainly want to connect with the right people. And it's a really good way to put it. There are people who, charge our energy, and there are people who drain our energy. And that awareness is really key. And so when we're talking about connection, we're not talking about connecting with the people that drain our energy. But sometimes, you have to really look inward to know, who's in which group. Because you want to connect with the people that are going to feel supportive, people that you feel safe around, people who are going to regulate your nervous system in a way that's calming. And I don't think people need to even look that deeply inward. You can feel it when you pay attention to how you're feeling in your body, how you're feeling in your nervous system. So that's a really good point.
Where it feels easy, right? And
Yeah.
and Dr. Julie, was there a time in your own life when you experienced a sense of disconnection or isolation, even while being very busy or surrounded by people?
Yes, definitely. There have been many times in my life when I was very busy, very responsible, very engaged on the outside. And yet inside I felt disconnected. And not necessarily because I was physically alone, but probably because I was carrying so much and moving so quickly that I wasn't fully in touch with myself. And when you're not deeply connected to yourself, it can be hard to feel deeply connected to others too. I think this is something many high functioning women know well. You can be competent, you can be caring, you can be in that constant motion, and yet there can still be this quieter layer underneath where you feel emotionally undernourished, or like you're holding a lot without enough support. And that experience has been humbling for me and also clarifying. It's actually one reason I care so much about this topic, because disconnection can be hidden inside a life that looks very full from the outside. And when we're so busy, doing, you may not even be aware that you're feeling disconnected from your own self, let alone people around you.
Yeah, this happens a lot, actually. I think I've had that experience with people that I love, and I know they're so busy. And sometimes I take it personal because I feel like they're not really there. We might see each other, but they're not really there. And I feel like there's some sort of distance, even when we hug. And then I think about it later, and I see the disconnection that this person is having with themselves. Like, too
Mm.
busy managing so many things that feeling connected to their hearts, themselves, their ability to connect with others is just really not there.
Well, that's really beautiful that you can sense that or discern that, and to not take it personally. That often when people have a hard time connecting, it is because they're disconnected from themselves, and it has nothing to do with you, right? But with themselves, and yeah, that's I think important to recognize. Um, so one, you don't take it personally, and then two, perhaps your friend needs some support. And yeah, just to check in, deeper, have more meaningful discussions, if you feel like that is what's needed.
And it's interesting to see it from the other side, right? Because sometimes we see, oh, how loneliness is affecting us or connection is affecting us. But when you see others you love struggling with that, and like you said, not take it personally, but also being able to be there for them without needing anything back from them. Maybe you're not able to connect,
Mhm.
but I'm here for you.
Well, that's that unconditional love, right? To give without expecting anything in return. Yeah, that is true love. And, that's what, those are the connections we want to surround ourselves with, to receive it, but to also give it. It needs to be an exchange. And that, each person has different seasons, right? We talk about that a lot, where, perhaps you can't give as much in one season and your friend can give more. And then, the tables turn. And that's part of a truly beautiful friendship, is when, people recognize that, there are these different seasons, and that there's a two-way exchange. Um, and that, we recognize that, sometimes we're the giver and sometimes we're the receiver.
That's a really beautiful point. Like, it's not always 50-50. Overall, it's nurturing for everybody, but sometimes people need more, sometimes you need more. And that's important to really have in mind when we're building meaningful connections, or when we're maintaining meaningful connections.
I just want to say one thing that made me think about the word balance. Like, we're always trying to achieve balance in life, right? Balance in relationships. And that doesn't mean that every moment of every day is going to be always balanced, right? That there's a continuum, and that, it, there are days when it's not balanced, or maybe like even a whole season, but that you find your way back. Um, yeah, it just made me think about the word balance, and relationships don't have to be equal and balanced every moment. And we don't have to live our lives in a balanced way every day, but that, we have awareness of what we need, and we pay attention to that and put intention to bringing back whatever our body, our mind, our spirit needs to feel good.
And about balance, like I not to get too philosophical on that, but I always question what is balance. We think that balance is 50-50 or that everything needs to be equal, like you said, but balance might be a greater thing that we're not able to see in the tedious aspects of life or in the minutia. It's a bigger thing. Like nature, sometimes there's hurricanes and that seems to be out of balance, but in the greater scheme of things, that is part of the balance. I
Hmm.
think there's always balance, even when it feels like things are off. If you have a season that is much more demanding, then that will harmonize eventually with other seasons of your life.
That I love that word, harmonize and harmony. It does, and it's so helpful to think about it in the context of nature, especially when we talk about the ecosystem. But that, yeah, what you're saying is that, you know, there are forces that don't always feel good in the moment, but when you look at the big picture, um, it all fits, and there's a reason, why there are, hurricanes and fires in nature. It does create, a harmony to the ecosystem. We do know that forest fires, natural ones, they burn away some of the shrubbery and create nutrients for the trees to grow. That's a very simple version of what I understand, to be, the natural ecosystems. But when we think about our lives in that bigger context and of nature, it really does help, and it takes away judgment. Sometimes there are hurricanes, sometimes there are fires, and in nature there seems to be grace, right? There's just grace is a part of nature, and to align with nature, I think is, a really good way to live philosophically and literally.
Yeah, I like just that this one part that you said about it taking away judgment. It's like all the difficult parts that we go through really strip away layers of judgment, and that alone increases our ability to connect with ourselves in a deeper way and with others over the long run. Because what would we be if we didn't have difficult moments? We wouldn't be able to empathize with other people or understand, or we'd be super judgmental. But once we go through certain struggles, then we see people in a different way. We see others in a different way.
Yeah. Well, that's the part of being human. And, we want to bring compassion to being human. And, that certainly is a better way to go about life, to feel our own emotions as we go through them. And that gives us more patience and insight when others also feel pain. And that when we tend to each other in relationship, that brings health. And I think, that's what this whole podcast is about. We're bringing to light the fact that relationships are just as important to our health and well-being, just like nutrition or exercise or sleep, which are, very obvious. Because our relationships, well, one, they make life more meaningful and interesting, but, they impact our physical health through our nervous system. And I think all of our listeners know that our nervous system impacts all the other systems in our body, right? Our digestion, our immune system, our hormones, etc. And so when we think about and talk about health and well-being, of course, relationships are an important part of that. I think everybody knows that intuitively. When, you have a problem with a important relationship, you feel it physically in your body. That lump in your throat, or, tightness in your chest, or, butterflies in our stomach, whatever the saying, there's some, truth to that.
Or heartbreak.
Heartbreak.
You
Yeah.
feel like your chest is like ripping apart. And Dr. Julie, on that note, um, in your clinical work, what patterns do you see in patients who feel lonely or unsupported, and how does that show up physically or emotionally?
What I see most often is that people rarely walk in and say, I'm lonely. Instead, they say, I feel anxious for no reason, or I don't feel like myself anymore, or I'm doing everything I can, but I still don't feel well. And as we start talking more deeply, you begin to hear the context. Maybe they don't feel emotionally supported in their relationships. Maybe they're always the one holding everything together. Maybe they don't feel like there's anyone they can truly exhale with.
Yeah.
Maybe they've been giving and functioning for so long that they've lost touch with their own need for care. I think, this is very common for women, especially those high functioning women, we've been talking about. So physically, that may show up as fatigue, tension, sleep disruption, headaches, digestive symptoms, increased sensitivity to stress, or just a sense that their body never fully settles. Emotionally, it may show up as sadness, numbness, irritability, anxiety, or feeling oddly disconnected from life, even when everything looks fine on paper. I had one person call it meh. I just feel meh.
Oh,
You know, so often what I see is not just a medical issue in isolation. I see a body carrying the weight of too much aloneness.
mm. And I know we've spoken a little bit about how people tend to withdraw socially when they're feeling exhausted or overwhelmed. But how does this create a cycle that can further dysregulate the nervous system?
Yeah. It's certainly natural when someone feels depleted, pulling back can feel protective. And sometimes it is. And sometimes rest and less stimulation are exactly what the nervous system needs. Um, but when that withdrawal becomes prolonged, um, it really can start to become isolating. And when you isolate and you stop letting people in, their world becomes smaller. And, that may reduce the immediate demand, but as we spoke about earlier, it's really also going to reduce the amount of support that you receive, or, perspective that someone else can give you. Um, feeling love and connection we talked about earlier. But one thing that I think people don't recognize is, the ability to co-regulate our nervous system with somebody else. And that is something that can be really helpful when we're in the physical presence with each other. And I think, that's what's so challenging in our modern lives today, is that people are so busy that it's hard to, be physically present. I'm even thinking about how I used to talk to people on the phone a lot more. And now I have texting relationships, and, that just removes a layer of connection. Though texting is good, it's better than nothing. But I do remember not that long ago, before texting was a thing, where I would talk on the phone. And that was just a lot more nurturing than texting. Anyhow, that's sort of a side note. So when people feel more alone, people just get more stuck in their own stress, and you often feel less resourced to reconnect with people. And the longer it goes on, the harder it is to take that first step back towards people. And that's why I think it's really important to distinguish between that restorative solitude versus painful isolation. And I think, that's really key, where solitude can replenish us, but isolation tends to harden the edges around us. And so it's really important to distinguish the two. And often it only takes one small, safe connection to begin softening that pattern. And, the key is feeling safe in that connection.
And yeah, like you said, harden the edges around us. Isolation can make us colder. And I feel that other people, when we isolate and we become colder, other people feel it and you kind of push them away. But that is hurting us even further because it feels so hard to push others away.
Yeah. I think it goes back to what you said earlier, how, you were able to not take it personally. Your friend, felt disconnected from you and from themselves. And that is a consequence when you isolate yourself. Somebody who's not so, loving and gentle like you were may misinterpret that as pushing the person away, when it is that, you need help, or you're not feeling your best and you need support. So that may be another message here, is that, when people start to isolate, don't take it personally, and maybe, they need support. And sometimes when we're there for somebody else, it can be nourishing, but it's a fine line. Yeah, you have to know yourself well. You need to do it in a way that's not going to self-abandon. You have to be in a place where you're able to give. But giving can be very nourishing when you're in the right place. So yeah, it is a bit complex, that push and pull in relationships. But I think if you're the one that's feeling lonely, you want to be aware of that and, take that first step.
Yeah, and I just wanted to mention something on co-regulation. I feel that as women, we co-regulate so well, and it's so sad for me sometimes that we can feel lonely in a world so full of people. And most of the times when it has happened to me, I don't know about other women, but I'm sure that can be a common theme. Whereas you feel lonely in in things that are happening to you, but they happen to many of us. And when we come together, we realize, oh my God, it just feels so good. Not because other women go through it, but that shared experience brings so much wisdom. And so it turns that loneliness of feeling like, oh, this is only happening to me, I don't know how to get out, it kind of becomes empowering.
Absolutely. Sometimes loneliness is feeling like you're the only one going through such experiences. And when you're talking and connecting with your girlfriends, you realize that that's not the case. In fact, there's a term called tend and befriend. I think it's in the psychology literature, but it's this idea that, when we tend to our friendships and we share and connect, that not only helps the other person, but it helps you as well. And knowing that other people are going through a similar experience is healing. And that's where, community can feel so supportive. Right now, my community is parents of teenage kids.
And you definitely need that community, to go through that. And Dr. Julie, in terms of boundaries and emotional safety, what role do boundaries and emotional safety play in building relationships that actually restore energy rather than drain it?
Yeah, this is a very important idea to talk about. Boundaries play a tremendous role because not all connections are nourishing. I think people hear the message that connection is healing and think that means they need to spend more social time, more interactions, or have more people around them. But quantity is not the same as quality. And if a relationship requires, that constant self-abandonment or caretaking or over-explaining, or, you feel that bracing in your body, it may not feel regulating at all. And actually it feels exhausting. So for a relationship to be restorative, there usually has to be some degree of emotional safety. There has to be room for honesty, room to be imperfect, room to not perform all the time. There has to be a sense that you can show up as yourself and not leave feeling more depleted than when you arrived. And that's when boundaries come in. Boundaries are not barriers to connection. They are often what make genuine connection possible. They help us protect our energy, discern where we feel safe, and create more space for relationships that are mutual and life-giving. So when we talk about healing in relationship, we're not talking about pleasing everyone or staying open to everyone. We're talking about learning to recognize the kind of connection that truly support the nervous system.
This is such a great point because it is true that certain relationships give us anxiety and we can learn to feel that when we walk into a room. Do we feel at ease about being ourselves, or do we feel, that performative aspect that you mentioned? Do I feel like I have to be overly giving, or are you just relaxed? Is it feel trust? Can you be as if you were alone in your home with others? It's silent even. No, can I just be in silence?
Oh, yeah. Yeah, that is definitely a sense of safety, being just present. Yeah.
And Dr. Julie, we've talked about health as an ecosystem, obviously. How does strengthening connection become part of someone's health ecosystem, not just emotionally, but biologically?
When I talk about health as an ecosystem, I'm talking about the many different conditions that shape how we feel and function. So not just food, not just hormones, not just lab values, but also stress, daily rhythms, environment, and of course, relationships and meaning. We talked about earlier how relationships are so important to our health. And it's a part of this ecosystem because they affect the body every day. The quality of connection in someone's life influences stress physiology, resilience, emotional regulation, and how supported or alone the body feels as it moves through ordinary life. If someone is living with chronic disconnection or relational strain or lack of emotional safety, that matters biologically. It becomes part of the terrain their body is trying to adapt to. And on the other hand, when someone begins strengthening connection, building support, and experiencing more relational steadiness, that also changes the terrain. So connection is not just an emotional extra. It is one of the living conditions that can either strain the system or support healing.
And what are some gentle, realistic ways people can begin rebuilding connections, especially if they feel out of practice or hesitant?
I think the best way to begin is by making it very small, very doable, and very real. A lot of people feel pressure to fix loneliness in some big dramatic way. They think they need to become more social overnight or suddenly create a whole new community. But for most people, that's too much. And it can actually create more pressure and people will feel more self-conscious. What tends to work better is just one simple act of reconnection. So texting one person you trust, saying yes to one invitation that feels manageable, asking someone to go for a walk or have tea, joining a class, a group, or a space where there is gentle, repeated contact without too much pressure. And sometimes rebuilding connection also means becoming more honest, letting someone know you've been having a hard time, admitting that you felt a little disconnected, not in a dramatic way, just in a human way. Connection usually rebuilds through small, consistent moments. It doesn't have to be big to be meaningful.
And Dr. Julie, for someone listening today who recognizes a sense of loneliness or disconnection, what is one small step they could take this week to move toward connection?
Well, again, I would start with one small specific step toward another person. I think, now that we're in a texting kind of world, send a text to someone you trust or reply to that text that somebody has sent you. Sometimes we see the text and it's like, too hard to respond in that moment. And then a few days go by and then you're like, it's too late to respond. Just do it. Just respond and see what unfolds. And keep in mind that it doesn't have to be, anything dramatic. When people feel disconnected, they often feel like they need to fix the whole thing at once. And that's often too much. So do something small that's doable. And that'll reinforce to the body and the mind that you're not completely alone here. And that is soothing to our nervous system. If reaching out to somebody feels too hard right now, then begin by reaching inward and do that with honesty and compassion. And you may say to yourself, very gently, I've been feeling more alone than I want to admit. And that kind of truth matters because once something is named with compassion, it often becomes easier to tend to. It comes to the surface, to our awareness. And that's where healing begins. In being honest about what you need instead of minimizing it, that opens the window to connection with yourself and then with others. And I think you said it earlier, we need to feel connected with ourselves in order to connect with others. So maybe that's the first step, right? To make sure you're connected with yourself, and then reach out in a text or a phone call. I think phone calls are definitely harder. That's why I say text. Well, I think we've come to the end of our time together. This need for connection is something I see very often in practice. Many people come in feeling exhausted, overwhelmed, or quietly disconnected, not just from others, but from themselves. And it's one of the reasons I created the Well-Being Ecosystem Reset. Inside the program, we gently work on strengthening the relational, emotional, and biological environments that help the nervous system feel safer and more supported. Because when connection improves, many other aspects of health begin to shift as well. I'd actually love to stay connected with you beyond this episode. If today's conversation resonated, I invite you to visit my latest post on Instagram at julie.taw.md and simply leave the word connect in the comments. Think of it as a small act of reaching out, a gentle reminder that connection often begins with one simple step.
Thank you for joining us for this episode of Medicine with Meaning. Healing doesn't happen in isolation. It happens in environments of safety, connection, and support. If this episode resonated with you, share it with someone who may need it. And we'll see you next time.
Bye. Thank you for listening.